lot of people say that Chinese is the hardest language. But have you ever thought to yourself, what's the hardest language for Chinese people then? Right? Because in a previous video, I talked about what's the hardest language. I approached this question and tried to answer it. Now, in that discussion, talked about a number of things. Has the person in question ever learned a language before, right? Because for somebody that has experience learning languages, one or more, it's going to be different for somebody that has no experience whatsoever learning languages. So if we take the question of, or the perspective of, for people that don't know any languages, we compare them to people, a native English speaker and a native Mandarin speaker, all right? Both of them want to learn Cantonese, is what I talked about in the last video. Both of them want to learn Cantonese. It's going to be way harder for the English speaker than for the Mandarin speaker, because the Mandarin speaker already knows Chinese characters. They already know what it's like to speak a tonal language. And then culturally, they have a lot of similarities, right? So they have a lot of references in common, that sort of thing. And so it makes it a lot easier for the Mandarin speaker to go learn Cantonese. So while Cantonese is one of the group 5, one of the hardest group of languages for English speakers to learn, it's not actually all that difficult for a Mandarin speaker to learn. So, and then I took that and I turned it on its head. Hey, if a native English speaker is going to learning something like Spanish or French, if they're going to learn Spanish, and you compare it with that Mandarin speaker, that same Mandarin speaker doesn't speak any languages, the English speaker will find it a lot easier to learn Spanish than the Mandarin speaker will find it to learn Spanish, because the English speaker has a lot of cognates in common. They also have the cultural references. They have some conjugations in their language, which Mandarin does not have conjugations, and etc. So they have a lot of like grammatical similarities, also in terms of cultural references and vocabulary. Okay, so with that sort of foundation, what about that question of what language is the most difficult for Mandarin speakers? I don't ever hear anybody really talk about this, but I think it's a very interesting question. So the hardest language for us maybe are easier for them. The hardest language, the actual hardest language, Japanese. Well, they already know the characters, the Chinese characters, which are called kanji in Japanese. They already know all those, so they don't have to deal with that. And I will point out, when I was studying abroad, I remember there were Japanese people in the class, and they would go from, like, it was their first contact with language, they went automatically to 3rd level. So they maybe 2nd level, but they would go typically to 3rd level because they already have the Chinese characters, a lot of them, the core ones, memorized, so they don't have to deal with that struggle. Except they have to deal with the grammar and the pronunciation. So they get a leg up in that sense. Now, as to the question of what's the hardest language for Chinese speakers, for Mandarin speakers specifically, I would expect that it would kind of be like the question, it would be like if you took the opposite perspective, right? So if you were to turn around, well, the hardest for us is, Chinese is one of the hardest languages, so Chinese, for Chinese speakers, it's probably like English, right? Now, a lot of people online, on the Chinese internet, they do say this, but most of those people only have experience learning English, and so they don't have anything else to compare it with other than just Chinese, their native language. That's like a lot of Americans going and only learning some Spanish and saying, oh, that's the hardest language, as it'd be that sort of thing, because it's the only basis for comparison. But if you were to ask me, I would say, personally, I would expect it to be probably a language that has conjugations, because Chinese just doesn't have any. And so that's just like a whole layer of complexity that you could probably say is more difficult to overcome in some ways than the tones for us. So for them to overcome all these conjugations, especially if you're going to throw in not just indicative, but subjunctive in there with, like a Romance language, I think that's going to be very a difficult hill for them to cross over effectively. And tones, in a sense, is a lot easier than that, because for Mandarin, there's only 4 tones plus a neutral tone, so 5 in a sense. Now, what do Chinese people actually say is the hardest language for them, other than English? I see a lot of people talk about German and Russian, and because they have cases and obviously that's very complicated. I would expect Hungarian would be up there, and anything else from that family like Finnish. But in terms of an actual definitive answer, I don't have one at this time because there's not a lot of hard evidence, just a lot of opinions from people on the internet and what I've seen over the years reading in forums from Chinese people. A lot of them, they tend to say German and Russian are the hardest. And when I looked at the question of which is more difficult, German versus Russian, it seemed like people Chinese people thought that Russian was more difficult for them. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And I did find some minority opinions. So I found one that said Georgian's really hard, but I wanted to try and look more at, the primary languages that people learn. So the main takeaway is Russian, but I would just say, as an aside, if you go and look at something where there aren't a lot of resources and you want to look at like objectively what's the most difficult language, then maybe it could be something like Georgian, or I saw somebody say, hey, Basque is probably the most difficult because it's a language isolate. It's not related to anything around it. And so it's like just vastly different. You don't get cognates at all. So maybe there is some veracity to that statement, but there's not gonna be a lot of data, and it's gonna be sort of thing is gonna be made more difficult by the fact that there aren't a lot of resources. So if we're looking at major languages, maybe the answer is Russian is the most difficult for Chinese people. Maybe that's what most Chinese speakers, most Chinese would agree. Most Mandarin speakers, maybe that's what they would agree, that for them, Russian's the most difficult. That's certainly the answer that I've seen most often for what is the most difficult. And when I've seen the Chinese speakers compare, German versus this or that, Russian versus this or that, it seems like Russian kind of wins out. So I guess English isn't the most difficult in the world after all. So it doesn't quite turn it on its head. Instead, it kind of Russian is a group 4 language for us, I think, or group 3 maybe actually, but for them, it would be a group 5 for them. So some kind of interesting. Different backgrounds, different takes. That's not scientific. This is all just people's impressions based on their own experience learning these languages, okay? So hopefully you took something away from it. If you speak something else other than English, hey, let me know what you think is the most difficult language for you. What do people where you're from, what do they find to be the most difficult language? Is it English? Is it Chinese? Is it something else? And if you speak English, based on your experience, what has been the most difficult language for you? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Until next time, though, y'all take care now. Bye-bye.